Welcome to lesson 9 of our cultural diversity training. This is where we are going to shift focus to working effectively with clients of African descent. My name is Desiree Cochran-Norfolk, and this lesson is going to challenge us to move beyond stereotypes and surface level understandings and instead engage deeply with the histories and the values and the just systemic barriers and also the strengths that have shaped the lived experience of African American clients and clients across the African diaspora. And a lot of people of African descent have a very rich and varied history of survival in the United States, despite disparaging odds. Although the U.S. was a country that was founded on principles and religious and ethnic freedom, discriminatory laws and historically poor treatment of individuals of African descent contradicted these principles. And so we have to understand the history of this group in the U.S. to truly understand and provide a context for how African American culture has developed and it's maintained. Kind of how the psyche and the racial identity and the worldview of people of African descent formed over time. The common presenting treatment issues of African American people in therapy, and also what is the deeply ingrained racism and discrimination that a lot of people of African descent face on a daily basis. So that's going to be a discussion of enslavement, the impact of one group of people being the legal property of another group of people on the collective psyche and the mental health of people of African descent. And we can't underestimate that. The historical and the current effects of this physical enslavement and psychological degradation is seen on African Americans. And this impact also underlies a lot of the common presenting treatment issues among African Americans in seeking counseling in the first place. So we may ask ourselves, how is counseling a person of African descent different than counseling individuals of other backgrounds? And the answer is that it's very different in some ways and not so different in other ways. And effective counselors are going to recognize that to really fully understand the clients and the clinical or the client issues, we have to recognize that each of us walks in a different world. We are all treated and judged differently based on perceived race and ethnicity and gender and perceived sexual orientation and our religious background and our height and our weight and our disability and our level of attractiveness and all these status variables in our society. And because skin color is readily seen, it's often the variable by which we are judged most quickly. And in working with clients of African descent, multiculturally competent counselors are going to combine their academic knowledge, their practical and personal experiences, and just basic common sense to really understand and be sensitive to our clients' varied experiences in their own individual worlds. So before we dive into the history and the theory, let's pause for a reflection here. Just take a moment to jot down your initial thoughts about individuals of African descent. What images or stories or assumptions come to mind? And then consider, are these reflections shaped by your personal experiences, by the media, or by stereotypes that you've been exposed to? The goal here isn't to judge yourself, but to increase your awareness. Counseling always begins with the counselor's ability to notice their own biases. So how might these thoughts positively or negatively affect your work with African American clients? Take a moment to write this down in your workbook. This lesson is titled Individuals and Families of African Descent because that's the most inclusive title of this population at this time. This lesson doesn't include individuals of North African descent like Egyptians, Libyans, Moroccans, but this information is discussed in other chapters in like families of Arab descent. So through time, Black Africans have been referred to as Negroes, Coloreds, Blacks, Afro-Americans, African Americans, whatever. And historically, Black Americans began labeling themselves publicly as a group, most especially in the 1960s with the slogan Black is Beautiful. And that represented the idea that as a people, Blacks could celebrate their own diversity of skin tones and that Black people had a very proud heritage to celebrate. And prior to that movement, African Americans in the US were named by those in power. So the term African American came about in the 1980s, coined by Reverend Jesse Jackson, and it emphasized that Black Americans' ties to Africa, as well as the country of their citizenship, the United States. And not all Africans wish to be called African American or Black. Therefore, a multiculturally competent counselor should ask their clients of African descent what they prefer to be called. So I'm going to use Black or African American or individuals of African descent interchangeably to reflect the ways in which a lot of Black people in the United States refer to themselves. But each term is going to be different, and they're going to represent for the individual a sense of their own identity and pride. But words matter. How people self-identify matters. The key takeaway is simple here. Don't assume. Ask the client how they prefer to be identified and respect their choice. For some, Black feels most affirming. For others, African American resonates. For others still, identity may be tied to their nationality, like Nigerian American or Jamaican American, whatever. So respecting the terminology is just a basic form of cultural humility. So according to US Census data, African Americans comprise approximately 14.4% of the US population. An analysis of immigration patterns finds that they come from really diverse places like Africa, the Caribbean, the West Indies, Latin America, Central Europe, South America, all over the place. And the Black population is expected to grow marginally in the next decade. The Black population is roughly distributed evenly between males at 48% and females at 52%. And that number really hasn't changed over the years. It's really kind of stayed the same, 48 and 52%. That's nearly 1/3 of the population is under 18 years old at 27%, and only 12% are over 65 years old. And the number of Black people immigrating from Africa and the Caribbean really is growing at a remarkable rate. So from 2012 to 2022, Black immigration rates have increased 23.5%. And if we look from 2000 to 2019, that number grew 246%. We went from 600,000 to 2 million immigrants from those areas. And African descent people disproportionately face a lot of issues, including struggles with poverty and unemployment at twice the rate of whites, and physical and mental health disparities like a lack of health insurance or a lower lifespan than whites by 5 to 6 years. And that number has actually decreased because it was 7 years about 20 years ago. So it is improving. But these are issues that are facing the Black community. Neville and Walters did an educational review of like education, economic, employment, mental and physical health issues in African Americans. And their numbers are a little bit different than what is going on now, but 25%, or is it, no, 28% of Blacks are college graduates now. It used to be 13%, all right? But that's in comparison to 42% of white people. So 28% to 42%. And then urban school districts, where a lot of attendees are Black, they receive about 16% less funding for each child compared to predominantly white school districts. And that number used to be 13%, so it is increasing a little bit, but it's still disproportionate. These poor urban schools often are going to lack important resources like computers, current textbooks, after-school activities, advanced placement courses, and so on. Nearly 17.9% of Blacks live at or below the poverty line, and that used to be 22%, so it has gone down a little bit. And blacks make up 32% of the nation's 1.8 million prison population, compared to 31% of whites and 23% of Hispanics. So a lot of these struggles are reflective of the oppression that blacks face in American society based on historic and current racial discriminations. And despite these serious issues facing individuals of African descent, African Americans' history of resilience and survival in even the most hostile and highly racialized climate can't be denied here. I just want to make it very clear and repeat these statistics for you. 32% of the African American prison population is African American. 32%, but they only make up 14% of the US population. That's the disparity here. I hear a lot of people say, oh, more African Americans are imprisoned than white people. And that's not technically true. More white people are imprisoned by number, but percentage-wise, that's where the disparity is lying. 32% in prison, but only 14% of the US population. And if we look at the white population, we have about 58-59% of the US population is white. Only 31% of the prison population is white. And that doesn't make sense. All right. So throughout their tenure in the United States, people of African descent have been labeled in many different ways. And historically, race was considered a biological construct. People were categorized based on phenotype characteristics, because Europeans were responsible for the categorical system that was based on race. The darker one's skin and the farther an individual's features were from the European standard, the lower the status of the individual in society. And racial categories were always a hierarchy, where the darkest individuals were compared to animals and the lightest individuals were compared to, being made in God's image. So this hierarchy system is evident in this one drop rule, which states that, having one drop of black blood makes a person black. And slave owners and subsequent laws obsessively classified individuals of African descent based on how much white blood they had. So for example, like mulattoes were half black, half white. Quadroons were 1/4 black, and octoroons were 1/8 black. And often the more white blood slaves had, the more white blood that they had, the more privileges that they had over their darker counterparts. So the lighter skinned slaves were able to work in the slave owner's house, and the darker skinned slaves had to work outdoors all day. And the slaves with the lighter skin were also considered more attractive by white slave owners because they were closer to the white beauty ideal. And the lighter skinned slaves were often the result of the slave owners sexually assaulting the darker slaves. And that's why a lot of the slaves were actually related to their slave owners for generations. Colorism still exists in Black communities today, where African Americans with lighter skin are often perceived as having an easier time than African Americans with darker skin. And there is some basis to this perception, both currently and historically. And it's a form of internalized racism, whereas lighter skin is sometimes more valued than darker skin in the African American community. So occasionally in Black families, parents or grandparents may knowingly or unknowingly prefer children based on skin tone. And this can often be a very painful issue that may not be openly discussed or acknowledged. In working with African American women, especially, this may be often be like a hidden treatment issue because skin color can be related to self-esteem, body image issues, and like feelings of attractiveness and so on. So a multiculturally competent counselor is therefore going to, explore the salience of the client's self-perceptions related to their skin tone that might be relevant to their self-concept or even their presenting issues. So we know that race no longer exists as a solely biological construct. We can't always look at someone and know what race they are. Race is a social, economical, psychological, and ideological construct. So, in other words, what race someone is has economic and social consequences for living in the United States. And it also shapes a person's worldview. And a lot of times, it shapes how they are perceived and treated by other people in the society. And in the US, race and social class are often confounded. So, for example, it's often assumed that most Blacks are poor. And the media frequently enhances that perception by depicting news stories and movies and television programs that support that idea. And this perception does not allow for the heterogeneity of among African Americans. So it's true that a disproportionate number of African Americans are poor relative to their numbers in the population, but it's also true that most African Americans are not poor. People of African descent have a distinct culture that's influenced by geographic region and origins. Um, it's influenced by ideology and social class and all types of different variables. Without understanding the diversity within African American culture, a counselor can't work effectively with clients of those backgrounds. You know, those with quote unquote black skin don't have all the same culture. You have Afro-Cubans, Black Americans, individuals from Ghana, and people from the Caribbean, and they all have similar skin tones, but their cultures and their values and their experiences and worldviews are going to be vastly different. Multiculturally sensitive counselors are going to educate themselves about the client's personal, their individual, and also their collective or group culture. That's why it's extremely important in working with clients of African descent to assess their level of acculturation and to really understand some of their cultural values. Assessment of acculturation level, I'm going to talk about in just a few minutes, but to really understand African mental health today, we have to grapple with that history. You know, the first Africans were brought to the United States in 1619, and then the histories of slavery and Jim Crow segregation and ongoing systemic racism and Black people in America have really just endured profound oppression. You know, we had that civil rights movement of the 1960s. It brought a lot of legal reforms, and the lingering effects of like redlining and mass incarceration and school segregation and employment discrimination, and that continues even today. So a lot of things that we have to consider, these historical injustices, they weren't just social. They shaped how Black families were treated by medicine and psychology and education. So I want you to think really quick. Jot this answer down. Think about the communities that you lived in or worked with. What examples of systemic racism, like housing, healthcare, policing, or schools, are visible around you? And how might those systemic inequities affect your client's worldview and trust in those institutions? Like I said, the first Africans arrived in 1619, and they arrived as indentured servants. And that's similar to how a lot of white settlers came. And within 20 years, there were laws against racial mixing and interracial marriages. And then soon after that, Africans started arriving upon the shores of the U.S. as slaves. So from the mid 1600s through 1965, laws were used to justify the physical and the mental and the spiritual abuse of African Americans. Early models of mental health pathologized Africans. So we had drapetomania was a noted mental illness of slaves who tried to escape from their owners. White Americans at the time justified slavery by assuming that Blacks were not human beings and that they could not feel pain to the same extent as whites. Laws considered slaves to be 1/10 of a human being. So during the years of that slave trade, Africans from different tribes were ripped from their families and their cultures, and they were forced onto severely overcrowded ships, where over half of them died before even coming to the shores of the United States. And then once they got here, they were sold away from family members to white slave owners. They were beaten, they were starved, they were forced to work 18 hours a day. And Africans were forced to give up their African names and their African culture, and they were given European names. Even their reproductive lines weren't their own because the men were often used as studs to make more slaves, and women were seen as breeders. And all the children born were considered property of slave owners, and many were promptly sold away from their families. So this nuclear family unit was seldom allowed to form among those slaves. And often slave children were raised by whatever adults and older children were left on that plantation. Rarely were those children, the children's actual relatives. So slaves made family where they found it. And although more traditional mental health models and the models of family therapy have pathologized Black families because a lot of them are not nuclear, that clearly has a historical basis, and it's not pathological. It is still true that Black families are not strictly nuclear, and Black children are often raised by their close biological relatives and extended family. And although the dehumanization and the denigration of the Blacks and the Black culture began in times of slavery, current society often continues that pattern. And those practices are seen in racial profiling, the criminalization of Blacks, and the view that Blacks are undesirable people and a group that should be feared. And then shortly after slavery ended in 1865, the Jim Crow era began. So briefly, Jim Crow laws maintained and supported segregationist policies that really governed the lives of Blacks in America. And these racist policies were enforced by legal institutions like the police and the courthouse through the 1960s. So throughout the history of the United States, Blacks have been made to feel unwelcome, undesirable, and pathologized. Blacks have been seen as like problem people, people that were seen to be hated and feared and a threat. And it is upon this backdrop that African values with American influences were maintained in that traumatic war zone of slavery and the Jim Crow era and continued racism and discrimination. And although racism and discrimination are rarely openly tolerated in today's times, they still exist. And today's racism is often passive, hidden, unconscious, and systemic, but it is still extremely damaging and hurtful. So, for example, recent research on healthcare disparities and medical treatment documentation show that African Americans often receive poor health care, more poor than whites, and they're often diagnosed with life-threatening illnesses and mental illnesses later than their white counterparts. So passive and unconscious racism can have devastating and life-threatening consequences for the lives of African descent individuals. And as a result, many African Americans are distrustful of medical and mental health professionals because in the not so distant past, Blacks were victims of medical experiments done without their permission, like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, and also involuntary sterilization in which they were harmed and even died as a result. The New York Press reported that the New York City foster care, which most of the children in foster care across the country are Black, but those in the New York City foster care system gave HIV positive children toxic experimental drugs for treatment without the children or the guardian's permission. And foster parents who refused to give children these drugs were removed from the parents' care, or from those kids' care. And so it's true that often the only contact some members of the Black community have with mental health professionals is when social workers come in to remove children from their home or through the welfare system. And in the U.S. school system, of the mid to late 20th century, Mental health professionals were also involved with the disproportionate labeling of Black children as mentally retarded. Intelligence tests, which had not at that time been normed on Black children or children of lower socioeconomic status, those were used as the sole measure for placing children into special education programs. And historically, these children were often placed in special education curriculum without their parents' knowledge or consent. And this past negative history has really contributed to the general cultural mistrust that some African Americans have of the government or medical system or the mental health professionals and the institutions. So there's an importance of assessing and addressing cultural mistrust early in the therapeutic relationship. Discrimination against African Americans has been legal, it's been normalized, and it's been violently enforced for centuries. These are not distant events that have happened. Their ripple effects are still visible today in our health, our housing, our education, our economic disparities. So in counseling, we have to recognize that African Americans are going to enter our sessions with an understandable mistrust. And they may wonder if we truly understand their context. It's our responsibility to build trust by naming systemic inequities instead of just ignoring them. Solely focusing on racial identity as opposed to cultural identity is really just too limiting because it forces a homogenic experience onto a whole group of people. In 1996, Landrine and Klonoff echoed those concerns in their studies of acculturation. So they asserted that the use of race and not culture obstructs a counselor's ability to understand human behavior. So the difference between racial identity and acculturation is that racial identity has to do with how one identifies oneself and if race is a key component of one's identity, whereas acculturation is going to refer to specific socialization influences and how one's racial identity is practiced. So acculturation speaks more to culture than race. So acculturation loosely refers to the extent to which ethnic and cultural minorities are going to participate in the cultural values, beliefs, and practices of their own culture versus the dominant white society. And we talked about acculturation in lesson 1, but in addition to that, acculturation can be viewed on a continuum from traditional to acculturated. So Landrine and Klonoff described 4 different groupings. So we have the traditional, which is the person who is immersed in many of the beliefs and practices and values of their own culture. And then we have the bicultural, which is the person who is in the middle of that continuum. They've retained the beliefs and practices of their own culture, but they have assimilated some of the beliefs and the practices of that dominant white culture or white society. So they participate in 2 very different cultural traditions simultaneously. And then we have the highly acculturated. And this is the person who rejects the beliefs and the practices of their own culture or their own origin in favor of the dominant society, and they never learned their own cultural traditions. And then we have the marginal. This is the person who either rejects or never acquires the beliefs and practices of their own culture or of the white culture. So a multiculturally competent counselor is going to assess how invested a Black client is in the traditional African American religious beliefs and practices, traditional African American socialization experiences and their values, and what are their preferences for African American things that are going to give the counselor an indication of that client's level of acculturation. Understanding a client's racial identity and their level of acculturation is going to guide the counselor in recommending or acknowledging appropriate support systems for clients. So highly acculturated clients may want to use Black organizations like churches or fraternities or sororities or Black-run charities or Black-owned businesses, and they want to use that as like a source of emotional or financial or social support. And referring to a Black client who does not consider being Black an important part of their identity to the traditional Black support systems in their community is going to be contraindicated on, and the client is going to be offended, basically. So it's important not to define clients of African descent only by oppression. Their history is equally one of resilience and of cultural wealth. Kinship networks extend beyond the nuclear family, often including like their grandparents, their aunts, uncles, godparents, pseudo family, and these ties provide vital support for raising children and sharing resources and just really maintaining that cultural continuity. And spirituality, especially in Black church, has long served as a refuge and an engine of social change. Churches offer not only religious grounding, but also political leadership and education and community organizing. And this collective resilience is seen in the survival strategies like mutual aid and activism, and really just in their creative expression, like music, from spirituals to jazz and hip hop and gospel. That's going to carry pain and hope. And this storytelling is going to preserve the identity and teach values. So as counselors, we can affirm these strengths and help our clients see them as tools for healing and growth. But despite the progress, African American clients continue to experience systemic barriers today. We have microaggressions, which are those everyday slights and invalidations, and that's going to erode the mental health over time. So, for example, assumptions about intelligence and professionalism are based on hairstyle or skin color. And then the economic disparities are going to persist. Median wealth for Black families is significantly lower than that of white families, and unemployment rates are consistently higher. In August of 2025, the unemployment rate for Black workers was around 7.5%, but around white workers it was 3.7%. And in the second quarter of 2025, the national Black unemployment rate was 6.2, and the white unemployment rate was 3.4. So that gives the Black to white unemployment ratio around 1.8 to 1. And health inequities are going to include higher rates of hypertension, diabetes, maternal mortality rates. And the criminal justice system is disproportionately arresting and prosecuting and incarcerating African Americans. And this not only impacts individuals, but it destabilizes families and communities. Counselors have to recognize how these inequities are going to show up in a client's presenting problem, like their anxiety or depression or anger, and how that's rooted not only in personal stressors, but also systemic injustices. There is no such thing as the typical Black family, as I've kind of stated previously. From slave times, Black families have not been strictly nuclear. Obviously, in Africa, children were raised in tribal cultures, and that didn't really emphasize the nuclear family as a primary unit. And early models of mental health and family therapy, they pathologized Black families and kind of characterized them as disorganized and deprived or disadvantaged kids coming from broken homes. Or fatherless homes, and that kind of promoted a matriarchal culture, which is really abnormal in our society. And these deficient views of Black families were perpetuated by applying those Eurocentric models of family therapy to Black families. And a lot of those Black families were female-led, but that doesn't automatically mean that there's no male involved in raising the children. So counselors need to be sensitive to the role of a lot of Black women as single parents and Black men who may be involved with their children but not living in the same household. Both those roles are going to involve multiple stressors. In 1989, Boyd and Franklin, and then in 2000, Boyd and Franklin and Hafer and Bry suggested a strengths-based approach when working with Black families. And that's going to involve assessing the family's strengths and utilizing those strengths in therapy to empower our clients. In 1972, Hill cited that some of the strengths of Black families are going to be a strong kinship bond, strong work orientation, adaptability, high achievement orientation, and also versatility. And these represent African-centered values and are kind of coping strategies of African descent people that they've used to survive societal oppression. So, for example, versatility of family roles grew out of necessity. And it's often true that in Black families, older siblings are responsible for helping to raise other siblings. Also, in 2007, Peters stated that the roles are not restricted to gender. like an older brother would be as responsible for helping raise younger siblings as an older sister would. So in Black families, a lot of these roles are determined by age, not gender. And Black families often keep generational secrets that are never talked about inside or outside of the family. And common family secrets are going to be maybe informal adoptions of children, the true parentage of children, unwed pregnancies, maybe a parent who had trouble early in life, substance abuse, HIV status, maybe an ancestor who was mentally ill, domestic violence, white relatives, skin color issues, all types of things. And Black parents and other adult caregivers are often racially socializing their Black children, whereby they're going to foster a sense of racial pride and teach children about their African heritage. And that's going to help that child develop a positive racial identity and discuss some ways in which to deal with racism. And this socialization often serves as a protective function against lowered self-esteem when children face racism. So, for example, when an African American child comes home and tells his mother of a racist incident at school, the child is less likely to believe that something's wrong with him personally because of that racial socialization. And Black families come in all different skin tones, even within the same family. And as I've said earlier, given that light skin was historically and continues to be valued over dark skin in our society, some of these Black families may have internalized this form of racism. So caregivers may deliberately or even inadvertently choose favorites or scapegoat children based on darkness or lightness of skin color. And that may present as a treatment issue in counseling, or may just simply be related to other treatment issues like self-esteem or even family conflict. And then African American parents, especially the working class parents, are more likely than whites to use physical punishment to discipline their children. And unlike the white children, physical punishment has not been found to be associated with more acting out among Black children. And in some Black families, obedience is valued and seen from parent to child as sort of a sign of respect and as an eventual survival skill to be successful in school and also in like future employment. And obviously, as you know, within other racial and ethnic groups, the level of education and socioeconomic influence, how those families are going to discipline their children. And African Americans are not an exception here. In the clinical realm, physical punishment should be separated from physical abuse, and one should not be confused with the other. So in working with Black families, it's recommended that counselors are flexible because religion and spirituality often are going to play a part in African American family life and their child rearing. So counselors are encouraged to be aware of and also involve the community resources and treatment, especially the Black church if the family is religious or spiritual. And also, we need to be flexible in our conceptualization of Black families. An assessment of involved extended family and fictive kin, like the non-relatives who are as close as and as involved as the family blood relatives, that's common. And so they should be included in the picture of who the family is. And counselors need to ask who lives in the home, who takes care of the children, and really understand how the multi-generational role of racism and oppression and poverty and victimization in both the past and the present are impacting those black families. So in using a strength-based approach with black families, a counselor is going to emphasize the positive values and the support systems and the strengths of that family. And we should focus on empowering the family to function effectively. And that can include restructuring the family so that the power is appropriately used to mobilize that family's ability to successfully interact with the external systems. Some common presenting issues of Black families may be finances, blending the families, missing father figures, siblings in the same family who have different fathers, different level of involvement with those fathers, violence, multi-generational role conflicts, and the negative impact of colorism and unemployment. So couples of African descent often face really unique challenges in addition to the common issues that couples of all ethnic backgrounds face. In 1970, couples headed more than 68% of African American families. And currently, the proportion of African American families that are headed by couples is 40 to 41%. And the divorce rate for Black couples is also higher than it is for whites. So, for example, Black couples' divorce rates are about 22 to 24%. But for white men and women, the rates were around 10 to 11%. So with Black couples, a lot of predictors of marital dissatisfaction are similar to other groups like conflicts, affairs, feelings of marital unhappiness. And the number of unmarried women has increased in all groups, but especially among African American women. Um, and that's in part due to a disproportionate number of incarcerated African American men. And also some of the growing educational attainment disparities between the African American men and women, and a high mortality rate of African American men due to homicide, and African American men who marry non-African American women, and those African American men who are gay. So marriage trends demonstrate that, African American women are less likely to marry than their counterparts of other ethnic groups. And compared to white people, African American report significantly less happiness in their marriage, and they're less likely to remarry after divorce. Some issues that are often unique to Black couples are going to include economic problems, unemployment due to the decreasing number of blue collar jobs that are available, women making more money than their male partners, which is going to cause conflict between the spouses. And then there's substance abuse, blended families that have multiple children in the same household with different biological parents. And then the sex ratio that favors men over women. So fewer marriageable men are available. And that often contributes to a power imbalance in the marital relationship, and, an increased incidence of affairs on the part of the male. There's also internalized racism on the part of both one or both of the partners. And then the realities and the pressures of daily racism that are faced by Black couples. And so these issues are going to significantly contribute to marital dissatisfaction. And then on the other hand, strengths of Black couples are going to include the support system often provided by the couple's extended families or the Black church or other Black organizations. And then like the gender egalitarian nature of Black couples, a cultural connectedness that's often shared by Black couples, and a flexible role orientation within the relationship. So Black couples and individuals are more likely to seek support from religious leaders more than counselors when they start to experience relationship problems. So multiculturally sensitive counselors need to consider collaborating with their clients, the client's community resources like their church leaders when we work with couples. And then also sensitive counselors are going to integrate couples' spiritual beliefs in psychotherapy because this is a strengths-based approach. And y'all pardon the use of my wedding photo here, but I thought it was cuter than a stock photo. But since the last of the miscegenation laws were repealed in 1967, there's been an increase in the number of interracial and intercultural couples in the US. And interracial and intercultural couples are going to face really unique challenges as well. So a lack of support by one another's family members, or maybe both of their family members, the social stigma that continues to exist for dating or marrying a partner of different ethnic backgrounds, criticism within their own same race community, fears of their children's adjustment to the biracial identity, social pressures from being stared at in public or being socially rejected solely on the basis of just being an interracial couple. Multiculturally competent counselors are going to understand those common issues that most couples deal with, as well as the unique issues faced by Black couples and the interracial couples. So these unique issues can have a really significant impact on the quality of a couple's relationship. And I can just tell you from experience, we've been sat at the back of restaurants, we've been stared at, we've been dismissed by certain people, not helped at certain places. Our children have had difficulty coping in school environments because they don't necessarily fit in with the white kids and they don't necessarily fit in with the black kids. And so they've had unique challenges themselves trying to find where they fit in and who is going to accept them and figuring out their own personal identity while still being rooted in two different cultures. And then we have children of African descent, and they're often going to face different issues depending on whether they come from middle or working class backgrounds and where they reside. Do they live in urban settings, suburban, rural, whatever? And so these inner city kids are often going to face a lot of issues of like poverty, disparity of educational resources, um, a lack of mental health and physical care, or even just the poor systems, the temptations of drugs and violence and teen pregnancy, and really just growing up in a predominantly female supported household. And they're also going to have fewer community support resources. The middle class children of African descent, particularly those living in suburban areas, are going to face difficulty with issues like fitting into the predominantly white environments, feeling isolated from the other children of color, being the only person of color in the classroom, having to develop bicultural skills, which is going to enable them to fit into the all black, all white environments. Maybe facing parental divorce or growing up with predominantly female supported households, feelings of like not being black enough or not being white enough, depending on their social environment. And when working with children of African descent, multiculturally competent counselors are going to be aware of several issues, including their racial identity and the problems that children might face given their school or their home or their social environments, and how racism is impacting their normal developmental challenges that they're facing. So effective counselors are going to be aware of the available culturally appropriate community resources for kids and their families. And we're also going to be open to including significant community members like ministers and things like that in the child's treatment if it's therapeutically indicated and if the parental permission is given. And then also considering biracial children here, that's going to be a big thing as far as any of our biracial children. So not just black, white, but any type of biracial child. You're going to have the dualities of the cultures and trying to fit in and not feeling white enough or black enough to fit in with any group. And so they're going to have difficulties with that. So about 46% of African American population is middle class versus about 55% of white people. And middle class African Americans often face different issues than the working class African Americans. So, like for example, the middle class African Americans are more likely to have to operate biculturally. So in both, they're going to have to be in like both all black and all white environments. And that can be very stressful, especially for the children and the adolescents who are just learning the implications for being black in a predominantly white environment. So these middle class blacks who are isolated from the black community are going to start to experience symptoms of depression and guilt for, making it. It's kind of like a survivor's guilt when a lot of others in the black community haven't. And this conflict is going to be stressful and it's going to have an impact on that person's mental health. And so social class is obviously going to have a distinct impact on the presenting treatment issues of our clients of African descent. And so as counselors, we need to assess and understand how social class is going to interact with and affect Black clients, their treatment issues, and also their experiences with discrimination. And across all socioeconomic levels, institutionalized racism is going to increase psychological distress for African Americans. Racial discrimination is a strong predictor of psychological symptoms. So that's just in general. And somatization and anxiety in particular are going to be found, you know, in there's a relationship between that, between the internalized racism and the alcohol consumption and the psychological distress and the depression and the lower self-esteem. So in total, Blacks are going to experience mental illness proportional to that of whites, but the contributing factors are going to be different. And clearly, regardless of the socioeconomic status, the psychological and the physical effects of racial discrimination are really damaging. So counselors should assess the impact of discrimination on their African descent clients' lives. So men and women of African descent are often going to bring different treatment issues into the therapeutic realm. Obviously, environmental influences are going to impact those issues. So in some therapeutic practice settings, some presenting issues of Black women are going to be like single parenthood, weight, skin color, self-esteem, depression, anxiety, parenting issues, economic struggles, basically a perceived lack of available same-race romantic male partners. And then we have, like childhood sexual abuse, which is common, domestic violence, inappropriate use of anger as a defense. There may be some relational mistrust and also some emotional intimacy issues. And so the presenting issues for men of African descent might be a formation of the Black male identity in a society that fears and rejects Black men as problem people. Maybe it's absent or distant relationships with father figures, self-esteem, economic struggles, domestic and other violence that happens, relational mistrust, emotional intimacy issues, depression, anxiety, substance abuse. The list can go on and on. And these issues are negatively influenced by Black men being perceived as threatening or dangerous in our society, and Black women being perceived as angry and unapproachable. And these stereotypes of Black men and women are internalized by themselves. And that internalization of those stereotypes is going to serve as an impediment to healthy relationships. So counselors who hold these stereotypical views of Black men and women are going to be ineffective and often harmful in their work with the clients of African descent. And as a whole, Black elderly people in the United States face issues of poverty, poor mental and physical health care, illiteracy, gender discrepancies, like Black elderly women far outnumber Black elderly men. There's employment discrimination, social and physical isolation, disability, grief and bereavement issues. And so some of these issues are identical to those faced by the elderly individuals as a whole in the United States. But a higher percentage of Black elderly persons that higher than white elderly people are poor. And so normal developmental aging issues are complicated by the interplay of poverty and racial discrimination. So issues faced by the Black elderly Americans are going to vary as a function of an individual's socioeconomic status or their health or their familial and community supports. And, as with all subgroups within the Black community, the multiculturally competent counselor is going to be aware of the economic and the social, emotional, and spiritual resources in the community that can be helpful to that population. And counselors are also going to attend to negative stereotypes or assumptions that they have about this client population. African American gay men and lesbians are going to encounter homophobia within their racial communities and racism within the white gay community. So gay and lesbian African Americans are often going to deal with multiple sources of oppression and discrimination. And they may feel conflicts and allegiances, like allegiance to the Black community or allegiance to the gay community. They're going to struggle to integrate the different aspects of their identities, like being an individual of African descent, being a woman, and being a lesbian. And then also feeling the pressure to hide their gay identity from their family and friends. Also, a lot of African Americans are going to hold a religious orientation, and a lot of the conservative Black churches don't support gay and lesbians. And so this is really going to be a painful experience for people who are gay or are lesbians who look to the Black church for social support and spiritual guidance. And it's going to increase the likelihood that they're going to face discrimination in their own communities and their families, and dealing with multiple sources of oppression is going to be extremely stressful. So when we work with gay and lesbian clients of African descent, it's going to be important to assess whether identity is going to conflict, like issues as a Black person or a gay person or both. And those issues, are they relevant to the presenting treatment issue in therapy? And then, as with all the other client populations, the multiculturally competent counselor is going to be aware of relevant community resources, and we're aware of our own negative assumptions about the client population in which we're working. So just like we talked about in lesson 2, we talked about models of cultural identity. So Black racial identity has been studied in depth. So we have Cross's Nigressen's model, and that describes the Black identity development, and that goes from pre-encounter, where Blackness may not be central, and then it goes to encounter, where racism forces identity into awareness, and then immersion, and then internalization, and then finally commitment. And these models are going to help us remember that racial identity is not static. A client's relationship to their racial identity is going to shift over time, and that's going to be influenced by social experiences, systemic oppression, and also personal growth. So as counselors, being able to explore where a client might be in their racial identity process without imposing any assumptions is going to strengthen our empathy and our guidance for those clients. And African American culture is not monolithic. It's diverse, it's resilient, it's deeply rooted in history. I was just talking in group about that today. I had a lot of influence by my great grandmother, and my great grandmother was born in the early 1900s. And if we think about this, slavery ended towards the end of the 1800s. So my great grandmother was greatly influenced by her grandmother, and her grandmother was probably alive when slavery ended. So we're only 6 generations from slavery, and that is not very far off. So we have to remember how history is really rooted in how these families are together or not together, how they operate with one another. And family often extends beyond the nuclear unit into the grandparents, the cousins, the community kinship, because that's what's been taught over the last 6 generations. Spirituality and religion, particularly the Black church, are going to play a central role in resilience and social justice. Values are going to emphasize collectivism and resilience, and there's a value of respecting elders and a strong identity pride. But within these values, there's going to be diversity. We have the middle class Black families, the interracial couples, the LGBTQ Black individuals, and also the LGBTQ couples, Black elders, and all of these people are going to experience cultural identity in very unique ways. So our job as counselors is to hold both the shared experiences of racism and the wide variety of the lived experiences within African American communities. So in exploring the physical and the mental health needs of Blacks, counselors have to have an understanding of the environment and the context in which African Americans exist, and how environmental factors are going to affect their expression, their interpretation, and their prevalence rates of physical and mental illness. There's a really great overview of a lot of the common physical and mental health issues from Wicker and Brody in 2004. So in brief from that, some common health issues are diabetes, heart disease, HIV/AIDS, prostate cancer, higher infant mortality rates, substance abuse, sickle cell anemia, lead poisoning, and teen pregnancy. And as I've mentioned previously, lower socioeconomic status, African Americans are more likely to receive poor health care and not have health insurance. And a lot of these physical illnesses have an impact on the development of the psychological disorders as well. And we know that African Americans are going to face higher rates of depression and trauma and PTSD, but they're less likely to seek mental health services. And that's because of a mistrust of the counseling profession. Past misdiagnoses or stigmatization and systemic racism have really left some deep scars in the African American community. And then there's stigma. Mental health struggles are going to be seen as a weakness or something to be handled within the family or the church. And then there's access to barriers, the cost, the lack of insurance, the lack of Black providers, and that's going to limit options. So as counselors, we have to normalize help seeking and validate the mistrust. Let them know that it is perfectly valid that you mistrust counselors. And we need to work to create culturally safe spaces. And support systems in African American communities are really powerful. Religion and spirituality, especially the Black church, are really cornerstones of community life. And historically, the churches have not only offered spiritual guidance, but also social and political and economic support. And other systems are going to include historically Black fraternities and sororities and other organizations like the NAACP or sister circles for Black women or brotherhood spaces for Black men. So when we're working with clients, don't overlook those. Ask about them. Explore whether strengthening these supports could be a part of healing. And Eurocentric counseling models don't always fit African American clients. Afrocentric psychological perspectives are going to center on cultural pride, spirituality, and community. So one example is NTU psychotherapy. This is a holistic, family-centered approach that's rooted in African values. And it doesn't mean you need to throw out traditional models like cognitive behavioral therapy or psychodynamic counseling, but it does mean that you have to adapt them. Integrate the Afrocentric concepts when it's appropriate and respect spiritual practices and avoid imposing Western norms as the only valid path. And one of the most harmful mistakes is pathologizing cultural norms. So, for example, a strong communication style or expressive emotion may be misread as aggression. And ignoring systemic racism is another misstep. Counselors who overfocus on intrapsychic issues without acknowledging the social context may inadvertently blame clients for problems that are rooted in inequity. So we want to avoid generalizations like the Black community thinks XYZ. Within group diversity is really enormous. There's differences in class, differences in religion, differences in region, and also immigration experiences are going to shape the person's identity. And then lastly, microaggressions matter. If a client says that they experience racism and the counselor downplays it, that rupture may end the counseling altogether. I'm kind of reminded here of a client that I had recently who came to me for an anger management assessment. And he did not believe that he did anything wrong because the other person they were on a golf course, and the other person came up to him and kept calling him boy over and over and over again. And for this African American client, he perceived the terminology boy as racist. Now, it took a little bit of prompting and questioning here, um, but the other person was of Asian descent. And so for that culture, boy is not considered a racist comment. It's not a racist term. However, the African American client who I'm doing an assessment for is considering this a racist terminology and thus becoming increasingly angry that this person is continuing to use the term. And so when I'm doing the assessment, I have to understand that experienced racism for the client and how that played in to his reaction to what was happening. I did end up giving him anger management though. All right, so let's talk about practice. When we work with African American clients, we want to build trust early. We want to address historical and systemic inequities and don't pretend like they don't exist. We want to be collaborative. We want to involve our clients in shaping the process. We want to invite their preferences. We want to acknowledge cultural supports, prayer, rituals, community networks, things like that. Those can be therapeutic resources. And we also want to stay self-aware. Our biases, our body language, our assumptions are going to shape the relationship. And we also need to use culturally congruent practices. And sometimes that means prayer. Sometimes it means involving family. Sometimes it means slowing down to allow for storytelling. But most importantly, bring your full humanity into the room. Our clients need to know that we see them as a whole, not just as problems to be solved. I'll give you an example that happened today. I'm trying to explain the psychological ABCs to our clients, and I'm going over the irrational thoughts from Albert Ellis, the 12 cognitive errors. And one of them is the cognitive error is that people are seen as wicked, and because they're seen as wicked or evil, they deserve punishment. And so I was explaining how this is a fallacy, and we can dispute that by saying, people are not necessarily evil or wicked, but they may be mentally unwell. And so I used the example of Hitler. And I explained that, Hitler did a lot of very bad things that a lot of people would consider evil or vile even. And I had to explain, did you know that Hitler was on methamphetamines? And so one of the African American clients spoke up and she said, well, there's a lot of people that use meth that don't kill other people. And I said, you're right. You're absolutely right. There are people like that that don't kill other people, but there's also people that have used methamphetamines and shoved babies in ovens. So there's a spectrum. There's a wide gap in what people do while they're under the influence. And when we're under the influence, it lowers our inhibitions. So we don't think rationally. And so when these people get into these situations, they're not thinking with their rational minds. And so enter Hitler, and he's the leader of a country, and he is on methamphetamines. And so in his position, he may not be making the most reasonable, logical decisions in the positions that he's in. And he's also facing World War II, right? So we have World War II, and now we have these concentration camps. And so I asked her at this point, do you think that treatment would have worked at some point in time in the beginning, before all of these concentration camps happened? Do you think that treatment would have worked for him as opposed to punishment? Because a lot of our clients have done some really, really bad things. And I likened it to people drinking and driving. And I said, the young lady who was drinking and driving and killed my sister, she is a very, very sweet young lady. And her parents grew up in the church, and so they raised her in the church. She goes to church every week. She is a God-fearing young lady, and she is just one of the nicest, sweetest people that you can ever meet. And she went out one night and she only had 2 beers and she was really tired. And so she was DUI less safe, and she veered over just a little bit and she went head on into a stopped vehicle at a red light, and my sister was in the passenger seat not wearing a seatbelt and went through the windshield, and it killed her instantly. Right? So would that young lady be considered wicked and vile and need to be punished because she killed someone else? Or do we think that treatment would work? Do we think that compassion would work? Do we think that a little bit of grace toward other people would work? And then I likened it to the fact that, did you know that Hitler was the reason that methadone was commissioned or discovered or created? Hitler commissioned his scientists to create something that was like morphine during the war because the United States cut off the morphine flow to Germany during the war. So the soldiers said, no morphine, no soldiers. And so Hitler commissioned his scientists to create something very similar, and they came up with methadone. And methadone has saved thousands and thousands and thousands of lives, even more lives than what was taken in the concentration camps. So if we look at the good versus the bad that some people have done, does the good outweigh the bad? And he is in a position of power over a country, so he's trying to get more land and do the things that his countrymen want for him to do. And so in the scheme of things, in his country, in his culture, he's doing what's acceptable. And then we moved into talking about things like child pornography and pedophilia and things like that. And I said, yes, absolutely. In our country, it is seen as vile. It is seen as wrong or evil for someone to be a pedophile and do things like that with a child. But in some Middle Eastern countries, they marry their daughters off at 13, 14, 15, 16 years old. And it is perfectly acceptable within those cultures. And those grown men who are marrying these teenagers are not considered pedophiles. It's not seen as vile, evil, or wicked. And they are not deemed as punished. So it's going to really depend on the culture that we're in, on the society that we're living in, as to what is evil and what is not evil. And this young lady, she couldn't separate religion from the thought process. And so I kind of explained to her that in the spiritual warfare, so she wanted to talk about God and the Bible and angels and demons and things like that, and how these people have spirits on them, and so they are seen as wicked. And so I said, just using that logic, the spirit is on them or affecting them. The spirit is not them. The person is not an evil demon. There may be an evil spirit who is messing with things and conducting some spiritual warfare within that person, but that person themselves is not evil. So do we then punish the person, or do we treat them with their mental health or their substance use and pray over them and provide grace and mercy the same way that our God provides grace and mercy? And so for that, she was able to kind of put 2 and 2 together and understand. So sometimes we're going to have to involve the spirituality into the treatment process and kind of weave it into our the things that we know about psychology. So this is kind of where we're going to translate learning into action. So we want to start with a little bit of self-reflection. What are your own biases and fears or assumptions about Black clients? And how do those show up in really subtle ways? I want you to use contextualization. maybe link some presenting problems with some systemic realities. So, for example, like a teen struggling in school may be facing stereotype threat or biased discipline practices. Validate the experiences of the racism. Validation is going to reduce the isolation and the shame, and it communicates respect. And then lastly, embrace advocacy. And sometimes that means helping the client navigate systems, but it also means considering your own role in advocating for equity in schools and healthcare and workplaces. So this case study right here highlights the intersection of personal identity and systemic bias. The student's frustration is not simply an anger management issue. It's a reaction to being unfairly stereotyped. So a Black male high school student is excelling academically but struggling socially. The teachers see him as angry, and when he expresses his frustration, and he reports feeling stereotyped and says that the teachers treat the white peers more fairly. And he feels pressure from his family to be a credit to his race while also feeling isolated from both the Black and the white peers. And so counselors can kind of help him name these experiences and validate his reality and explore some of the coping strategies that are protecting his mental health without silencing his voice. And then on a systems level, advocacy might involve meeting with the teachers to address that implicit bias or collaborating with the administrators on equity training. So the key point here is that working with clients of African descent is going to require both individual counseling skills and systemic advocacy. But I'd like for you to go ahead and answer these in your workbook. How might the racial stereotypes shape the teacher's perceptions of this student? How could you reframe his frustration as resiliency or advocacy rather than pathology? And what systemic issues at school need to be addressed alongside the individual counseling? And then as we close, remember that working with African American clients and clients of African descent broadly is going to require humility and ongoing education. Affirm the strengths, the kinship networks, the spirituality, the resilience, the creativity. Contextualize the challenges within the systemic oppression, not as a personal failure. And then balance the direct counseling skills with advocacy for systemic change. This is lifelong work. Every client's going to bring unique experiences, and our role is to listen deeply, validate authentically, and we want to use our power to change inequities where we can.